The reason why this video is late was because I was just done making the video complaining that 11.0.7 wasn't going to have any balance tuning. The entire point was, it's gonna feel kind of sad now that you have the announcement from Blizzard that it's gonna be much faster and easier to grind your gilded quests, to gear up your characters. So now you add your alt that was a Preservation Evoker, a Havoc Demon Hunter, a Feral Druid, a Brewmaster Monk. However, that would have still felt kind of bad because your presence in a 12 plus key in Mythic Plus was less than 2%. Meaning you had to be declined in about 49 different keys before the 50th one actually invited you. And then you would get into the key, pull the first 4 packs at the same time, instantly die, disband the group, and go back getting declined 49 times. So, the excitement of, oh well, the patch is coming, it's faster to gear, and then my character is being buffed. So I have the incentive of playing this alt character isn't really there. However, Blizzard has just come, literally minutes ago, barely an hour ago, with the announcement of the balance tuning actually coming in 11.0.7. So let's go and take a look at what is changing, starting by ignoring the useless points that we don't care about. Point number 1, Holy Priest is getting buffed again. Literally, the last balance tuning we received, they had their Holy Wards buffed, now they're getting their Flesh Shield being buffed, and also their Holy Fire damage being buffed. This is roughly inconsequential, and should not really change too much. There is a slight buff in the raid when it comes to Resto Shaman. Resto Shaman in the raid has been pretty much middling to average for the entire progression of this expansion. The reason was their mana. The reason was how much do they have to spend. Resto Shaman, if they could, they would be here. Because they actually do have the ability to do tons of healing, whereas other specs are more gated by the cooldowns of their combos, like for example Preservation Evoker or Discipline Priest. In the case of Resto Shaman, it's more very simply about the mana they have to spend to be able to support that much healing, which gets helped this patch by reducing the cost of Surging Totem by 25%. This will be the equivalent of a bit more, actually, than a full mana potion per fight. Even almost 2 mana potions actually in a fight like Silken Court and a fight like Ansorek. So this will amount to slightly more healing for the Resto Shaman, not because your healing is being buffed, but because now you actually have more mana to be able to heal. You then have another healer being buffed because Holy Paladin gets buffed. Veneration transfers more of your damage done into healing, as well as more absorbs from Saved by the Light, and then more flat damage by Consecrate. Veneration is part of the new, style of Holy Paladin, who after the huge Lightsmith buffs has moved over to Avenging Crusader and basically doing damage and healing players, which includes Veneration. It is a slight increase in terms of healing throughput overall for Holy as well. Now, as for the actual DPS specs though, so first of all, we can see before even going through each and every one of them that the specs being buffed are going to be Unholy, Havoc, Devastation, Marksmanship, and Affliction. So at first glance, you have Unholy being buffed, you have Havoc being buffed, you have Devastation being buffed, you have Affliction being buffed, you have Marksmanship being buffed. So practically all the specs at the bottom are getting buffed. You're like, but Izen, what about Frost Decay and what about Balance Druid? They are also at the bottom and not being buffed. Well, they have a bit more of a leeway because at the very least, Frost and Balance are amongst the meta specs in Mythic Plus. At the very least, they have some of the better results and they are definitely more considered in the options in Mythic Plus. Frost, of course, is taking over Unholy when it comes to melee options, whereas Balance Druid, it is still being quite played in Mythic Plus as well. But for those other specs, they didn't even have that option. Devastation is right here. Affliction is right here. You can switch over to melee DPS. Unholy, as we mentioned, was low. You have, of course, Havoc, which is right over here, and you have the 2 Hunter specs, which includes Marksmanship. So very low representation in Mythic Plus, poor results in the raid. So these are the specs being buffed by these changes. Now, the first one is the Unholy buff, which is more of a single target kind of buff for the very simple reason that you get the buff to Apocalypse, ghoul damage increased by 30%. And at the moment, Apocalypse is your 2-go option, not for Mythic Plus, but rather for the raid is where you go with Apocalypse. You also get the buff to Rotten Touch, which increases the damage done to your primary target of that coil up to 60%, as well as the damage of that coil itself being buffed by 8%. And that coil, again, if you're fighting in Mythic Plus, in whatever 17 key Arakara, you know, getting that coil buffed by 8% in Mythic Plus, of course, won't have on multiple targets, won't have that much of an effect compared to if you were fighting, you know, one of the bosses, for example, a pure single target, actually not fully single target boss, but definitely more relevant in single target when it comes to that coil as well. So it is a more single target focused, which is also understandable because of course Unholy's single target right now is what's the app description for this single target damage of Unholy? Well, poor would be the description, which has often been one of the biggest problems of Unholy when it comes to Mythic Plus, for example. You look at the Mythic Plus, you look at the DPS, and you're like, hold on a second, but Unholy is doing good Mythic Plus damage. Well, yeah, they have other problems than AoE damage, which they are currently just fine at, particularly cleave and shorter number of enemies in pools, as well as straight up single targets being their problems. This is the buff they are receiving. After them, you have Demon Hunter. Havoc gets a Fellblade damage increased by 10%. You also have the Hunt being increased by 10%. This is for both Havoc and Vengeance, of course, since Vengeance also has access to Fellblade and the Hunt from their general tree. And then for Havoc itself, you get Chaos Strike or Annihilation, damage increased by 10%, and then Demon's Bite or Demon's Blaze, the passive effect or the active one, are increased by 10%. Now, it is rather self-explanatory, the size of these buffs, whether you are looking at a Mythic Plus key or a boss. Buffing things like Demon Blades by 10%, buffing things like Fellblade by 10%, buffing things like the Hunt by 10%, you know, it's a very small increase for Havoc Demon Hunter. Definitely the largest damage increase would be to your Annihilation / Chaos Strike in single target. This can amount to being a 3, maybe 3 to 4% damage increase in single target for Havoc Demon Hunter, which is also, as mentioned, one of the things they're not being particularly good at when it comes to single target damage on bosses. So the expected kind of buff you would give to Havoc Demon Hunter, more single target focused. Much simpler to translate are the buffs given to Devastation, because all they get is 4% all damage increase, and then AoE damage increase by increasing the damage of Pyre by 20%. Now, Pyre normally has this kind of damage share in Mythic Plus, so we're talking about a 3-ish% damage increase on top of the 4% damage increase you are getting from buffing all of your toolkit. So it's a 7-ish damage percent increase in AoE fights in Mythic Plus, and slightly less than that, 5-ish% or so when it comes to the raid, if you consider the raid will also have some bosses with multi-target damage phases where you will still be using Pyre as a Devastation Evoker, which was also one of the poor ones when it came to damage, especially single target damage, but in their case their AoE gets buffed as well, so it's a 7-ish% buff in Mythic Plus as well, for example, which should also, you know, make them significantly better compared to how close the rest is right now when it comes to AoE damage in Mythic Plus. It's definitely some help. Of course, we know, technically speaking, it's all useless because at the end of the day they still have to compete in their class with augmentation, but the thought of buffing the Underperformer right now is the correct one when it comes to Devastation. Talking about Underperformers, you have another one of the Underperformers right over here, Marksmanship Hunter, which also gets buffed. You have more share of the ricocheting damage of trick shots, up to 75% from 65%. Same goes for Razor Fragments AoE damage, going up to 35 from 25. And then Dark Ranger is being buffed. Black Arrow, Shadow Surge, and Bleak Powder buffed for Marksmanship's Dark Ranger. Which is why it is a little bit sad of a buff, at least partially, because Dark Ranger is not being played by Marksmanship. Whether it is Mythic Plus or the raid, is still just Sentinel. So this chunk of the buff right now for Marksmanship is not really that worth. It's mostly just the trickshot damage buff and the Razor Fragments damage buff in AoE, which is then again also kind of useless because Razor Fragments and that entire side of the talent tree has been completely abandoned by Marksmanship Hunter, even in AoE, to go towards the right side of the tree. So again, it's practically less a buff to Marksmanship, but rather an attempt to buff the underplayed tools of Marksmanship. So in this case, buffing Dark Ranger, which is not being played, and buffing Razor Fragments, which is also not being played. So not good. Basically, the TLDR is not good. You would have much rather seen this treatment given to Marksmanship, you know, all damage increased by 4%, aim shot damage increased by 20%, and call it a day, rather than having these changes, which are just very poor for Marksmanship. The last of the DPS being touched is Affliction. Affliction gets haunt damage increased by 75%, which looks like an amazing buff, massive numbers, until you then realize that haunt does basically no damage, whether it is in AoE or a single target. I mean, haunt can only hit one target anyways, so it does absolutely nothing. You have Focused Malignancy, causing Malefic Rupture to deal 25% increased damage to targets suffering from UA instead of 15. This is good. Oblivion damage increased by 25%. We are back down the Marksmanship Hunter ways of trying to buff something that is not being played for Affliction Warlock. Xavius' Gambit increasing the damage of UA by 5 extra percent, as well as more damage from Perpetual Instability, and Siphon Life increasing the damage of Corruption by 30 instead of 20%. Yes, you have heard this before. This is Xavius' Gambit, this is Perpetual Instability, and this is Siphon Life. This is for the raid. If you go over to Mythic Plus, still not played, still not played, still not played, and still not played. So again, unfortunately, this is not a actual buff like the one given to Devastation, or even the one given to Havoc or to Unholy. This is more of the Marksmanship Hunter flavor of buffing things that aren't even being played right now. So technically, as long as none of this is actually getting played, the buff to Affliction is practically 1% right now, which is not what you would think would have been needed to increase the performance of Affliction in the raid, for starters, when it comes to single target damage, or even their performance in Mythic Plus, which, to be fair, was better than the one they were having in single target in the raid. Now that this is all listed and done with, of course there is the part where we now complain, because first we were about to complain that this patch coming next reset was being shipped without any balance tuning. Now though, we have gotten the balance tuning added to this set of changes. However, after going through said balance tuning, it is still quite disappointing. Most of the changes aren't actually going to be impacting much, especially the changes that don't affect specs currently played talents or even hero talents, like in the case of Marksmanship or in the case of Affliction. You were expecting, you know, significantly larger sets of buffs. When you think about Marksmanship Hunter and you see them being buffed, you expect something more than a 2% damage increase. Same goes when you look at Havoc Demon Hunter, something larger than a 2 to 3% damage increase. So yes, technically true, the balance tuning actually came, so we're not gonna get through an 11.0.7 patch without any balance tuning whatsoever, but now this makes it even more depressing, because now we know that after this patch, after we will have a break through the Christmas holidays, and with 11.1 stage to be released somewhere mid-February, we actually might be looking at the last of the balance tuning for this season, for this patch, before we get into the next season. And you know, if this actually ends up becoming the last patch, we would have kind of wanted to see it go out with a bang, with some slightly larger numbers and some more of the specs currently underperforming being targeted, which did not definitely happen with this set of tuning. So for today, on a disappointing note, we can leave each other on this Friday. Thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone who is supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I guess it was good luck that I delayed my video by like 3 hours, and by the time it was done, I actually saw the news of the balance tuning to change video completely.